What if I told you that in the middle of a congressional hearing about free speech, someone accidentally exposed a secret no one was supposed to mention? It started with a single awkward question that seemed innocent enough. You can't remember if you're meeting with the president? The room went silent. Cameras zoomed in. The witness laughed it off nervously. But what came next turned that harmless exchange into something much darker, a pattern of silence, evasion, and contradiction surrounding the mysterious Epstein files, a list that was supposedly on the Attorney General's desk, then suddenly didn't exist at all. And the question no one in that hearing seemed willing to answer: who's trying so hard to keep it buried? Because this wasn't just another chaotic moment in Congress. It was a crack in the armor, a glimpse into how power protects itself when the wrong people start asking the right questions. The hearing began as routine discussion about speech laws, media oversight, procedural issues, the kind of technical policy conversation that rarely makes headlines. The witness was Mr. Farage, a British political figure testifying about free speech regulations in the UK and Europe. Standard congressional testimony, supposed to be boring and forgettable. But then one congressman changed the tone completely. He noticed the witness preparing to leave early and asked a simple question: "Where are you going?" At first it sounded like small talk, maybe even slightly rude, but the witness's response was strange. He became evasive, uncomfortable. "I'm not going to tell you what I'm doing this afternoon," he said defensively. The congressman pressed, "You're meeting with the president?" The witness smirked, tried to deflect with a joke about discretion being different from free speech. But everyone in that room knew something was off. Because what came next wasn't about lunch plans or afternoon meetings. It was about the Epstein list and a Department of Justice that seemed desperate to pretend it didn't exist. The congressman, clearly frustrated after months of stonewalling, launched into a devastating timeline. "It's been 9 months since we've been meeting in these hearings. We've not had Attorney General Pam Bondi here, even though we have jurisdiction over the Department of Justice. Not Bondi, not FBI Director Kash Patel." The chairman interrupted to say Patel was coming in 2 weeks and the AG in 4 weeks, but the congressman wasn't satisfied. "Fantastic, but we're still not doing that this week, the week we're having votes on the Epstein thing." Then he laid out the contradictions that have defined this entire saga. Pam Bondi gives these Republican influencers a binder, says Part 1 of the Epstein files. Don't know if you saw it, it was quite spectacular. The Attorney General then says the Epstein list is on her desk. Then DOJ issues a memo that says there is no list. He paused, letting that sink in. "The list is on my desk. Then there is no list. Then we gave binders to Republican influencers. This committee's had no hearings on any of how that transpired at the Department of Justice." Think about what he's describing. The nation's top law enforcement officer publicly states that the Epstein list exists and is literally on her desk. Then the Department of Justice, which she runs, releases an official memo stating no such list exists. That's not a minor communication error. That's a fundamental contradiction about whether evidence in one of the most significant criminal cases in modern history even exists. And Congress, the body with constitutional oversight over DOJ, has held exactly 0 hearings to reconcile that contradiction. But the congressman wasn't done with his timeline. Then the president comes out and says the whole thing's a hoax. He blasts his own base. He blames Barack Obama, who hasn't been president for a very long time. Republicans then in committee vote against the release in the Rules Committee. Then Republicans refuse to go back in the Rules Committee because they're getting blasted for their vote, getting crushed by their own base. This is where it gets really interesting. Politicians from the president's own party were voting against releasing the Epstein files, and their constituents were so furious that these politicians literally refused to return to committee meetings because they couldn't face the backlash. That's not normal political disagreement. That's representatives actively defying their own voters to protect something or someone. The congressman continued. "We leave. Congress leaves a day early. Then the administration sends the Deputy Attorney General to meet with Ghislaine Maxwell in jail. He happens to be Trump's former personal attorney. Stop right there. The Deputy Attorney General, who previously worked as the president's personal lawyer, makes a prison visit to Ghislaine Maxwell, Epstein's convicted accomplice. She says something favorable about the president. Miraculously, she gets transferred to a minimum security prison. The president starts talking about how he has the right to pardon her if he wanted to. The leaks to the Wall Street Journal then stop. Let's break down that sequence. Maxwell meets with a high-ranking DOJ official who has personal ties to the president. Shortly after, she's moved from high security to minimum security prison, a highly unusual transfer for someone convicted of sex trafficking. Then the president publicly floats the idea of pardoning her. And immediately after that, media leaks about the case, which had been flowing regularly, completely stop. That's not coincidence, that's a clear pattern of leverage and incentives. We come back from break. We have the Massie petition, the congressman continued, referring to Representative Thomas Massie's discharge petition to force release of the files. The Commerce Department does a document dump where 97% of these documents are already public. How long has he had those documents? Why hasn't he released them for the last 6 weeks? Does it the day of the vote? This is a classic Washington move. When pressure builds for transparency, release a huge stack of documents to create the appearance of cooperation. But make sure 97% of what you release is already public information that anyone could find online. It looks like disclosure, but it reveals nothing new. And the timing, releasing it on the exact day of a vote about forcing fuller disclosure, is designed to take the wind out of reformers' sails. Then Republicans drop a non-binding resolution trying to kill the Massie discharge petition. The White House said passing the Massie discharge petition is a hostile act. The congressman's voice rose with incredulity. Passing a discharge petition to release the Epstein files, the White House said, would be a hostile act. We have no questions about that. But why? Why is it that we're spending so much political capital to keep this list from coming out? That's the question that matters. Why is an administration spending massive amounts of political capital, alienating its own base, contradicting itself publicly, and calling transparency efforts hostile just to prevent release of files about a dead criminal? What's in those files that's worth this much protection? The congressman then turned to the witness, who had been sitting uncomfortably through this entire recitation. You think the list should come out? You think we should know the people who dealt with Mr. Epstein? The witness, clearly wanting to avoid this topic entirely, said, I thought I was coming to a hearing on free speech, not process. The congressman fired back. Do you think the list should come out? We have victims that were sexually abused by potentially people in power, and we don't know who's on the list. This is where the exchange became most revealing. We don't know who's on the list. We don't know if the president is or is not. I'm not going to say he is or isn't. I'm just going to say these are weird behaviors. We don't know that there aren't other people in Congress on the list. We have no idea. Do you think the list should come out? You think people in power should be held to account for these victims who have been sexually abused and assaulted? Another member interrupted to point out that the witness had actually previously called for the Epstein files to be released, pulling up receipts of his prior statement. The witness, now clearly uncomfortable, tried to deflect again. You can ask me about Social Security policy. We are here to discuss free speech. The congressman shot back. Is it awkward for your lunch after this? Do you agree with yourself? The chairman finally intervened, defending the committee's process and saying the FBI director and attorney general would testify in coming weeks. But the damage was done. The awkward confrontation had exposed something much bigger than one uncomfortable witness. It had exposed a systematic effort by multiple parts of government to avoid accountability on the Epstein files through contradiction, deflection, carefully timed releases of useless information, and political pressure. To understand why this matters, you have to think of oversight like a chain of custody. Every file, every record, every binder tells a story about who held power and who still does. When an attorney general says, "The list is on my desk," and the DOJ later says, "No list exists," that's not confusion. That's a custody problem. Who moved it? Who has access? Who decided what gets shared? Because when files go to political influencers instead of congressional investigators, that's not transparency. That's damage control disguised as disclosure. For survivors of Epstein's abuse network, every delay feels like betrayal. They were promised justice, cooperation, closure. Instead, they get headlines, contradictions, and procedural excuses. Each time a new memo claims no list exists, each time a politician calls the issue a hoax, survivors are forced to relive the silence that protected their abusers for years. And while officials insist secrecy is to protect privacy or national security, survivors hear something else. We still don't want to talk about it. There are legitimate reasons certain details can't be public. Ongoing cases, classified investigations, the need to protect victims' identities. Those are real, but they don't explain why the story keeps changing. You can protect survivors without protecting enablers. You can redact victims' names and still release the names of those who profited, covered up, or participated. The issue isn't privacy, it's selective secrecy. And when secrecy serves power more than people, it stops being law. It becomes manipulation. What would real oversight look like? Start with a secure congressional briefing that gives cleared lawmakers access to every unredacted file under strict confidentiality. Then create a chain of custody log showing exactly who accessed what and when. No mystery, no, it was on my desk. Finally, appoint an independent investigator, an inspector general or special counsel, to verify that no documents were hidden, altered, or politically manipulated. If everything is above board, transparency will prove it. If not, the record will speak for itself. The American people can handle facts. What they can't handle is being lied to by the institutions meant to protect them. When the government story keeps changing, it's not confusion. It's a signal that someone's still protecting someone. And as long as that's true, victims remain unheard and justice remains unfinished. That's why this chaotic, seemingly meaningless hearing matters. Because one lawmaker finally said it out loud. Why is this committee spending so much political capital to keep this list from coming out? That question deserves an answer. Not next year, not after another election. Now. This is what institutional cover-up looks like in real time. Not dramatic conspiracies, but boring procedural obstruction. Lists that exist then don't exist. Documents released that reveal nothing new. Political pressure applied to stop transparency efforts. And when someone finally asks why, the room gets uncomfortable and everyone suddenly has somewhere else to be. That congressman's timeline wasn't speculation, it was documented fact. And the fact that nobody could explain or justify any of it tells you everything you need to know about who's being protected.